Hey, my name is Todd, and about 9 years ago, my family and I moved from Northern Virginia to Guatemala, where we get to serve as missionaries there. We serve with a church called Iglesia del Camino, and it's a bilingual church in a little town called Antigua in Guatemala. And every year we get an opportunity to come back and be not only with our family who lives here in the Mid-Atlantic, but also to be with our different church families as well. And you all really are part of our church family. You support us in our work down there, but also there's some relationships that go way back. Maureen and I have known Stephanie and Matt for, I think, 25 plus years. And we continue kind of that relationship, and we're encouraged by that. But then since we've been in Guatemala, you all have also sent folks down. Kyle's brought teams down, Paula's brought teams down, and it's allowed us to have greater relationships, friendships with folks that we might not normally have, as you all have participated in what we do in Guatemala. So this morning, the first thing I want to say is just simply thank you. Thank you for being the local church here in Southern Maryland and doing what you do here. But then thank you for supporting us, the local church in Antigua, Guatemala. We together extend the kingdom. And so we could not do what we do in Guatemala without you. So thank you. Give yourselves just a quick round of applause, because it really does mean a lot to us. Now, I'll tell you this. This morning, I want to share some things that the Lord's been teaching me. And so on some level, I'm just simply passing on what I've heard, and the Lord's trying to impact my life to you. And what I want to start by talking about is the house that I lived in when I first got married. 32 years ago, my wife and I lived in this little house in Warrenton, Virginia. It was a little house behind a bigger house, and so at some point it probably was servants' quarters or something. I don't know what it was, but there was just a kitchen and then a living room and then a bedroom. It was more of a hallway than a house. And it was so small that the bathroom was actually in the kitchen, to the point where you could take a shower and flip pancakes at the same time. This is how small it was. And it was an old house, which meant that the electrical system was old as well. So early on in our marriage, I made the decision that I would take care of the ironing. In fact, some of you might say I raised the bar too high, too early. But nonetheless, I did the ironing in our house, which was great when it worked, because you lay out the ironing board, you plug the iron in, and then you do the iron. And it's the combination of your own pressure and the heat that makes things work. But this old electrical system in this house had old outlets. And these old outlets were the kind of outlets when you plug in something, you've got to bend the prongs out a little bit just so it'll stay plugged in. And so what would happen with me is I would be ironing, and I wouldn't know, but the plug would come out from the wall. And when the plug would come out from the wall, I'd find myself giving just a little bit more pressure because there was less heat. And then a little bit more pressure, and then it would lead to some frustration. And I would have no idea why this ironing is not being Zen-like, but rather is just bringing me frustration. And I wanted to quit. And the reason I tell you about our little house in Warrenton, Virginia, is because that is an illustration of how many of us live our lives. We live our lives unplugged. We're unplugged from the source that would bring us success. We're working harder and harder to get somewhere, harder and harder to achieve something, but we're not connected to Jesus. And so we're missing out. And hard work isn't a bad thing. Hard work is actually a really good thing. Hard work is a biblical value. In fact, if you grew up here in the United States, that's one of our kind of core values as a country, that people work hard. You pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You work a little bit harder to get to where you need to go. And again, not a bad thing, but it's not the complete thing. In fact, when I was on staff with Young Life with Matt, we had our staff folks read the book by Stephen Covey called 7 Habits for Highly Effective People. And the whole idea of reading that book was to try and do things just a little bit better, a little bit more effort, or make your effort work a little bit better for you. And in fact, right now, I listen to podcasts by a guy named Michael Hyatt. And Michael Hyatt teaches me about time management and leadership, areas that I want to get better in, areas where I want to grow, areas where I want to put more effort. And so I'm trying to grow myself. My wife loves Rachel Hollis. And I don't listen to Rachel Hollis, but subliminally I do. You see, my wife listens to Rachel Hollis on her iPad in our bed when I'm trying to go to sleep. And so as I'm dozing off, I'm hearing these things about self-reliance, and I'm hearing these things about setting goals that are entering into my brain as I doze off to sleep. And that's a good thing. That's a good things to be involved with. And any number of us this morning, we could go online, we'd use our credit card and pay a large amount of money to hear Tony Robbins tell us how to live a breakthrough life. And Stephen Covey, Rachel Haas, any of these people, they're bringing some good things. But honestly, if it's not plugged into Jesus, it's not going to get you the results that you want. You need to know this, that your very best effort, okay, your improved system and how you're going to live your life, your new goal for the year that you're writing down every single day, your prioritized list, if it's not plugged into Jesus, it will not get you the results that you're looking for. And I know this because of my own personal experience. I know this when I look around and see other people, but I also know it because I met with a guy, his name is Gil, and we sat down for coffee not too long ago. And this was in Antigua, Guatemala. His wife was actually in Guatemala taking Spanish classes. Well, Gil's story is that he grew up in Mexico, and his family legally immigrated to the United States. They ended up in Chicago. And as a young kid, being an immigrant coming into the United States, he really embraced the American dream. He knew that his parents gave up so much to get him there that he needed to pursue that American dream. And so he did. He did really well in high school so he could get into a really good college. After college, he went to law school. Law school went so well, he became a lawyer, and he was so good at that he became a professor. But he got to the point where he was teaching, and he was doing, and he was making the money that he wanted, but it felt hollow. There was something missing, and that thing that was missing was Jesus. And he got to the point where he said, I've achieved the American dream. I've done all those things that I want to do, but here's what it's led to. It's led to a hollowness. It's led to an emptiness. And now he's in Antigua, Guatemala. His wife is learning Spanish so that they can now go and serve in the Dominican Republic, because for him, that was what would be more fulfilling, that he's connected with Jesus. And for each of us, there's a different way to do that. Gil's story just has him ending up in the Dominican Republic. But it's because he got to a place and realized that it was empty. You see, living unplugged is a really dangerous way to live. You can invest all sorts of time, all sorts of money into something and realize it's not getting you where you want to go. It's also a way to live that takes more effort. It takes more effort to live unplugged. I mean, as I'm ironing a shirt, it takes more pressure and more physical effort to get the wrinkles out if I'm unplugged. And if we're honest with ourselves, and this morning, this should be a safe place where we can do that. If we're honest with ourselves, then we battle that every single day. And it's not just folks who live everyday normal lives, but it's also folks who are involved in ministry. All of the ministries that we're connected with in Guatemala, if they get unplugged, they will not see the results that God wants them to see as people reach out and as people give effort. So I want to share with you a couple of different ministries that we're connected with in Guatemala. And I want to encourage you that they've thought about, we need to be connected with Jesus in order for it to make a significant impact. First ministry I want to tell you about is a ministry called Mil Casas. And we build houses down in Guatemala. The goal in the valley where our church is to build 1,000 houses over the next few years. We are at I think this week, we are house number 490. This is incredible. This is a great thing. And what these houses do is you move a family like this from a dirt floor house with cornstalk walls and a leaky roof. You move them from that to a safe and secure and dry home that they can call their own. And it's a really exciting thing when you hand over the keys to somebody after you've built a house. And SouthPoint has built some of these houses over the years. Well, here's the thing. It's just a house. And without Jesus, it's just a house. And does it change their lives? Sure. It makes a difference in their lives. But the scriptures say this. The scriptures say that the name of the Lord is a strong tower, and the righteous run to it, and they're safe. They're saved. So we don't want to just build houses. We want to build strong towers. We want to build places where people can come in and a family can grow in the relationship with Jesus and make an internal difference. But they can only do that, and we can only do that if we're plugged in. There's another ministry that I'm really excited about in our church, really one of the most dynamic ministries. On Thursday nights, there's a group called Celebrate Recovery, or we simply call it in Guatemala, Celebremos. It's a group of men and women that gather together to overcome addictions. And people are putting in incredible efforts to do this. And you know, if you've been around an addiction, if you've had an addiction yourself, or there's been an addiction in your family or someone close to you, you know how much work it takes to get to the other side of that addiction. And so on a regular basis, people are getting over their addiction to drugs, or getting over their addiction to alcohol, or getting over some sort of character flaw that they need to work on. And they're celebrating that on Thursday nights. And so on Thursday nights, when somebody makes it to 3 months or 6 months without a drink, we celebrate that. That should be celebrated, and it's an incredible thing because they're getting freedom from what has held them back. But that's just a temporary freedom. In fact, it's not the freedom that Jesus offers. The whole reason Jesus came here was to set us free. In fact, there's this incredible passage in the scriptures where Jesus goes into the temple, and he asks for the scroll to be handed to him. He's handed the scroll of Isaiah. And he reads this passage that I'm going to read to you. And when he reads it, he knows it's about himself. But the people he's talking to, they don't know this yet. Here's what he says. He says, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim the good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight to the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." That's real freedom. Jesus showed up to set the prisoner free, to set the oppressed free. That's the freedom that needs to be a part of the Celebrate Recovery program, and it is. It's intertwined in there so that people are not only getting freedom from addictions, but they're getting freedom in Jesus, and that makes all the difference in the world. Another ministry we get to be a part of is a church in Guatemala City. It's called Iglesia Refugio. And one of the really cool things about that is you guys are the local church here in Southern Maryland. You are helping us, the local church in Antigua. And in turn, we get to help the local church led by our friends Rami and Shirley in Guatemala City. And it's this little village alongside some abandoned railroad tracks. And one of the programs that they do, and one of the things that they're trying to do, really is change the upcoming generation. And so they know that they need to take care of these kids. And many of these kids have got families, broken families. They've got unemployment is huge. There's prostitution in this area. There's drugs are in this area. It's just all sorts of negative things that are happening here. But Rami and Shirley are trying to feed these kids on a Sunday morning before church. And they're trying to feed them on a Monday afternoon before they do homework and on a Wednesday afternoon. And they know that they need to feed and fill these empty bellies of these kids who are just desperate to have caring adults come alongside them. And it's exciting of what they're doing. And it's exciting to have 70 kids sit around and get fed rice and beans. But the really exciting thing is that Rami and Shirley, there's no question in their mind that physical food is important, but spiritual food is that much more important. That when Jesus says, "I'm the bread of life, and whoever comes to me shall no longer hunger," they know that it's not just about rice and beans, but it's about rice and beans in Jesus. When Jesus says, "Drink this living water," and when you drink this living water, you'll never thirst, it's not just about the Kool-Aid that goes with the rice and beans. No, it's about the living water that Jesus offers, because they're plugged in, and they need to be plugged in order to make a really big, significant difference. And then finally, I want to tell you about Elevate, or Elevate. Elevate is a ministry happening in a little town called Santiago Zamora. Santiago Zamora is about 5 miles away from my house. This is a ministry or a town where we have been connected our entire time in Guatemala. And so we've got relationships there, long-term relationships that are 9 or 10 years old, and we love investing into the families there. Well, this ministry, Elevate, is helping kids learn how to read. And Maureen, my wife Maureen, is part of this ministry as well, and she's teaching folks English because we're right outside of, that town is right outside of a tourist town where if you want to get a job in a hotel or a restaurant, then having English is going to help get you there. And so learning how to read and learning English is shaping the future of the lives of kids that are in this community. Well, the amazing thing about this is that they are also connecting them with Jesus. They're also connecting them with the one who has the plans. They're also connecting them with the one who has the future in his hands. We've all memorized the passage out of Jeremiah where God says, I know the plans I have for you, right? We've memorized that, and it's such an encouraging verse, but it's interesting because the context of that verse goes like this. The Israelite nation was struggling before they heard this verse from Jeremiah. Before they heard Jeremiah say, God saying, I know the plans I have for you, plans for hope and a future, they were struggling. And you know what happened afterwards? They continued to struggle. But they knew that the plans were God's plans. And so for these kids, we are not solving the solution, we're not giving the solution to poverty in the little town of Santiago Zamora, but we are giving them and leading them to the one who can give them a hope and a future. And it's because this ministry is plugged in to Jesus. Now, I do want to take 10 seconds real quick and just do a little quick commercial. This particular ministry right now is using an SUV on a couple days a week where they fit about 15 or so kids into their SUV. The SUV, I think, holds 7, so they're more than doubling the capacity of their SUV. So they are in the process of raising money to buy a ministry van. If you have a heart for that, you want to talk to us about this, just meet us out at the table on the way out. We'd love to connect you with this particular ministry so that they can continue to not only change people's futures, but connect them with the one who holds their future. Okay. All 4 of these, vibrant ministries. All 4 of these, ministries that need to be connected with Jesus in order to have the success that they're searching for. We struggle with the same thing. We need to be connected with Jesus in order to have the success that we're looking for in our lives, in our relationships. And the disciples struggled with the same thing. Yet they had Jesus right in front of them, but they struggled with the same thing. And this morning I want us to look at Mark chapter 6. So if you've got the scriptures on your phone, would you look it up, Mark chapter 6? If you've got a Bible with you, do that. But we are going to pick it up about midway through the chapter. And the context is this. The disciples had been sent off to do ministry. They came back. They were excited to tell Jesus about what had been going on. Jesus, at the same time, had just recently heard that his cousin, John the Baptist, had been beheaded. So the disciples are coming back from ministry. They're tired. Jesus is grieving. And the disciples, it says, had not even eaten yet. So Jesus says, okay, let's get away and let's get some rest. And so they get in a boat, and as they cross the lake, the people who were interested in what was going on with the disciples, interested in Jesus, actually ran around, and they got there first. So by the time the boat showed up, those people were already there. And this is where we're going to pick up this passage. It's in Mark 6, verse 35. And it goes like this. By this time, it was late in the day. So his disciples came to him. This is a remote place, they said, and it's already very late. Okay, so the disciples are going, we see the problem being set up here. It's already late. We're out in the boonies. We're not close to anything. There is no 7-Eleven nearby. So let's pick up, see what they say next. They say, here's the solution that the disciples have. Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages to buy themselves something to eat. You see, the very best effort of the disciples was get rid of the problem. They were tired at this point. And we've been there, but they were tired and they were ready to quit. We can't do this. We can't handle it. We went across the lake to get away from these folks, and yet they found us. We can't feed them. And so the very best effort they had was, the very best idea they had was, let's go ahead and, Jesus, let's get rid of them. But they didn't realize who was standing right in front of them. If they were plugged into Jesus, I think they would have had a different idea. But instead, the idea was, let's get rid of the problem. So apply that to your life before we get farther into this. Have you been there? Have you been at that place where you're ready to quit? Where you're just tired? Where the problem is bigger than any solution you can come up with. So the solution you're thinking of, let me just step away from it. Let me quit. Let me move that problem. If that relationship is causing me that much problems, let me send them back to their home. Let me let them go to their house and figure out how they're going to eat. It's not my problem. Honestly, most of us live there at some point or another. And you would think as Jesus responds to his disciples, these men that he's been building into, you would think he would have just this great amount of compassion for them. But his response is interesting. He says this. He says, you give them something to eat. No, Jesus, you don't understand. What we just said was, we're in a remote place. We don't have any food. There's too many people. Send them home. And Jesus' response is not compassionate towards them. Jesus' response is, no, it's up to you. Let's do this together. Let's figure out how to solve this problem. Because earlier in the same passage, there's a very famous verse where it says, Jesus looked out over the crowds, and when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them. He had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. It actually says that they were harassed and helpless. So Jesus' compassion in this passage is not for the disciples, it's for the crowd that is there and is hungry. Then we'll pick it up again. He said to them, give me something to eat. And they start complaining. They say, that's going to take more than a year and a half, or a half a year's wages. Are we to go spend that much on bread and then give them to eat? In other words, Jesus, have you counted the cost? You know what this is going to cost us? Jesus responds and says, how many loaves do you have? Go and see what you've got. And they come back and they say, we've got 5 loaves and 2 fish. And if you're familiar with this story at all, you know that over in John, those 5 loaves and 2 fish come from a little boy that brought his bag lunch that day. He's the only person in the entire crowd that was ready for a day of ministry. He's got 5 loaves and 2 fish. And so that's what we're starting with. And if that's all you and I would start with, we probably would want to quit. We probably would want to send people away because it's just simply not enough. And if you're not plugged in, that's exactly what your mentality is going to be. If I'm not plugged in, that's exactly what my mentality is going to be. But Jesus goes on in verse 39, it says, Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and 50s. Jesus had a plan, and he was about to carry it out. And he was about to carry it out right there in front of the disciples. He was about to make a difference in a time when the disciples wanted to quit. And you've got to see just the vast difference between those two attitudes. The disciples had sent them away, and Jesus said, no, have them sit down. We're going to do this in an organized fashion, and we're going to feed these people. Verse 41, Jesus takes the 5 loaves and 2 fish, and he looks up to heaven. He gives thanks. He breaks the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. He fed them. This little boy's lunch feeds all these people. And this wasn't a magic trick. This wasn't, sleight of hand. There wasn't other food that was there. This was simply Jesus doing what Jesus does. And he wants to do this with us as well. We've got minimal things that we can bring to the table. We've got minimal resources. We've got minimal gifts and abilities. But Jesus wants to take those and multiply them for the greater impact, even when we want to quit. So I know this, when I'm plugged in, I can iron the shirt and I can get rid of the wrinkles. If that plug's falling out of the wall, then I start working harder and I get more frustrated, I'm more tired, and it doesn't get me the results that I'm looking for. But in this passage, the results are clear. Give me the next one, verse 42. It says that they all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of pieces of bread and fish. They all ate. This huge crowd is there. The disciples are there. Jesus is there. 5 loaves and 2 fish. Everyone eats. And I love this picture because there are 12 basketfuls. 12 disciples who wanted to quit. 12 disciples who connected with Jesus, saw this miracle happen right in front of them, and 12 disciples holding 12 baskets with more than what they even started with. This isn't good math. This isn't how it works. But in Jesus' economy, it's exactly how it works. He takes the very little that we have and he multiplies it. The disciples would have quit, but now they're standing there with leftovers, all 12 of them. And in verse 44, it says that the number who had eaten was 5,000. 5,000, and we know in that context or in that era, really they just counted men in that era. So if you count the women and children, it could have been 10,000, 15,000 people. But this incredible amount of people who ate on just the 5 loaves and 2 fish. And then the next passage, very often this is seen as a passage that's just by itself, the feeding of the 5,000. And then we go to another passage and we separate them out, but they're linked together. Because from there, Jesus then sends the disciples ahead, and he goes up on a hillside to pray. So here's that idea again where, okay, get in the boat, cross the lake one more time. It's darker now. Maybe we can go someplace where you can actually rest. So they're going across the lake, and Jesus is going up on the hillside to pray. And then we go back to verse 47. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Jesus saw the disciples struggle. The disciples are against the wind, just trying to find a place where they can rest, and they're straining. They're giving it all they've got, and they're not getting very far. And Jesus sees that. Okay, there's a biblical principle in this little passage right here, and that's very simply that Jesus sees us in our struggles. He knows what you're struggling with. Even that thing that's embarrassing and you haven't told anybody else, but you're struggling with it, he sees it. He sees it. He sees you straining at the oars. He sees you having trouble with your finances. He sees you with that relationship that's been nothing but trouble. He sees and he understands, just in the same way he did with the disciples. Well, it's interesting because what happens next is that Jesus tries to catch up with the guys. And actually, it's funny because the scriptures say this. Scripture says Jesus headed across the lake. So he began walking on water, heading across the lake. And in some passages, it says that he was about to pass by them. So the boat's here, and Jesus is just making his way across the lake, about to pass by them, just knowing, hey, really, I want to get to the other side. And at that point, it's when the disciples actually see him. And it says this, they see him, they thought he was a ghost, they cry out, and they were terrified. And Jesus says to them, take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. And I want you to catch this. The guys are in the boat straining. Jesus is walking. When they see him, they think he's a ghost. And then it takes Jesus actually saying, take courage, it is I, before they actually get to a place where they're calming down. We, just like the disciples, need to keep an eye out for Jesus showing up in our struggles. They're straining. They're trying to make their way across the lake. And they see Jesus walk across, and they don't even expect him. I feel like our attitude should be completely different. We should expect Jesus to show up in our struggles. We should expect him to show up when we're straining, because he does that. That's part of his job, part of his business. It's what he does. He does that in our lives. And so we ought to be looking for him in the first place. And then secondly, we ought to be able to recognize him. The disciples thought he was a ghost. We ought to be so intimate with Jesus that when he shows up, in whatever context, we recognize him. We go, we know who that is, and we know he's going to make a difference. In fact, he just fed 15,000 people. We know in this context, this is not a big deal for him. We're straining against the wind, but it's Jesus who's going to make a difference. So we need to be on the lookout for Jesus, and then we need to be able to recognize him. And we pick it back up in verse 51. It says he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. Jesus gets into the boat, and the wind dies down. Without Jesus, straining against the wind. With Jesus, there's peace. The wind dies down. Apply that to your very own lives. What are you straining against? What are you just struggling with? Invite Jesus into that so that the wind will die down. Invite Jesus into that so that he can make a difference. Because without Jesus, we're straining. With Jesus, the wind dies down. The point of this morning, and part of what I want us to and what God's been teaching me, is this. Our very best efforts on our very best day cannot compare to what Jesus can do in our lives. We've got gifts and abilities. There's some talented people in this room, but none of that compares to what Jesus can do. So an iron in and of itself does not take the wrinkles out of a shirt. It's got to be plugged in order for it to actually do what it needs to do. And the scripture is really clear on this point. In fact, Jesus is clear on this point. When he talks about the vine and the branches and being connected, how the branches need to be connected with the vine, he says very simply, apart from me, you can do nothing. There's nothing that you and I can do apart from Jesus. We can't cross the lake. We can't raise a godly family. We can't pray. We can't have any real impact because we're not connected. We're not plugged in. And that would be a depressing verse if there weren't other verses that complemented it. Paul talks about the same idea when he writes to the Philippians. And when he writes to the Philippians, he says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I can do nothing without Christ, but I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I can cross the lake. Okay, I can love my wife and my kids. I can love my neighbor. And in my case, my neighbor has a dog with a digestive problem. And that he has that digestive problem on my front lawn on a regular basis. But with Jesus, I can love my neighbor. I can live a life of integrity. I can have an eternal impact because I'm plugged in with Jesus. Because Jesus is more. Jesus is more than our effort. Our very best effort on the very best day, Jesus is always more. He's more than anything we can produce. He's more peace, he's more joy, he's more power. All of these things are in him. And as we close up, I want to share a passage out of Ephesians because I think it really gives us a picture of all that Jesus is. You see, Paul in the beginning of Ephesians 1, he says he's praying for that church and he wants them to know more of Jesus. And at the end of Ephesians, he shares, or the end of Ephesians 1, he shares just this little bit about Jesus. He says that God placed all things under his feet, that's Jesus' feet, and appointed him to be head over everything for the church, which is his body, the fullness of him who fills everything in every way. God's placed all things under his feet. God has placed all the things that we give our efforts to under his feet. God has placed the things that we struggle with under his feet. Your work, under his feet. If you're a student, your classes, under his feet. Your family, under his feet. Your relationships, under his feet. These are all things that he has control of. All things that it just makes sense. Plug into Jesus because he's already got these things under his feet. Your finances, under his feet. Your future, under his feet. There's just no question. It's this idea of he fills everything in every way. He's who we should be connected with. And we should work hard. I mean, that's part of it. Yes, you and I should work hard. But you and I should work hard with Jesus. Mark Batterson says it this way. He says, you should work as if it depends on you, and you should pray as if it depends on God. Because it does. Both of those things are true. But the formula isn't this. The formula isn't plug into Jesus and then relax. No, the formula is plug into Jesus and then do what Jesus is asking you to do. You plug into Jesus, and then you arrange the people on the mountainside in groups of 50 and 100, and then you feed them. You connect with Jesus, and then you get in the boat, and you go across the lake, pulling at the oars because Jesus is with you. So you're not getting out free. There's no work involved. There's work involved, but you're doing it, and you're getting to that success that much quicker because you've got Jesus, and you're plugged in with him. So the idea is this. The pressure that I apply when ironing only works when it's connected to the heat. So I can apply pressure all day long, but it's not going to have the results I want unless I'm plugged in. And so for you and I, the great gifts and abilities that we have, which it's important to know and make notice of, that those gifts and abilities are from him in the first place. So those great gifts and abilities that you have only work in combination with Jesus. And you might be able to fake it for a while, and many of us do. But eventually you're going to run out. You're going to be like my friend Gil, who goes, man, I did all these great things, but I found it to be empty at the end. So you've got to get plugged in to Jesus. So there are 3 groups of people in this room this morning who are not plugged in. One of those groups of people are folks who just have never had the opportunity to plug in with Jesus in the first place. You just don't have a relationship with him. Well, I want to encourage you with this. This might be your day. This might be the day that you for the very first time, begin a relationship with Jesus and get plugged into him. And I'd say this, if you got invited by a friend and you don't know Jesus, turn to your friend and just say, how do I get plugged in? And if they don't know how to help you to get plugged in, then they'll introduce you to somebody else in the SouthPoint family who can help you to be plugged in. So that's one group of folks, and I would encourage you, this really could be an incredible day for you as you begin your relationship with Jesus and you plug in for the very first time. The second group of people are folks who are unplugged, but they don't even know it. They've been plugged in with Jesus before, but they started seeing some success in their own abilities and their own gifts. And so they're finding themselves just starting to work harder and harder. And I would encourage you, just check back in. Check the wall, see if you're plugged in or not. See if you're doing the things that help you remain connected with Jesus. See if you're doing the things that help you to recognize him when he shows up. That may be you, it may be somebody else in your family, but I would encourage you to get plugged back in and do those things. Get involved with a small group, have your own personal devotional life. There's all sorts of things that allow us to get plugged in. And then there's a third group, and these are folks who have purposely pulled the plug out of the wall. They've just said, I've tried it, and it didn't work, and so I'm not willing to try it again. Would you just give this week an opportunity for Jesus to show up? That would you just plug back in and watch that iron get just a little bit hotter in your life, perhaps maybe not easier, but at least more peaceful? Would you allow him to get in the boat and allow the wind to die down so that your life would be different? And here's how I think we all can do that. You may already be plugged in. You may be not plugged in. But I want to encourage each of us for this next week, next 7 days, to attempt one thing every day this week that you could not do without Jesus. And what that's going to do is this. It's going to create a greater sense of dependence in your life, a dependence on Jesus. You're going to be plugged in. You're going to be counting on him to show up. And the other thing it's going to do is going to allow you to create a habit so that weeks from now, you're still living in that same way, that you're still living in a way where man, I would never do this without Jesus. And here's what it might look like for you. It may be that tomorrow you go and have a conversation or you make that phone call to that person that you've been avoiding. And you've been avoiding it because it's difficult and it's awkward and you just don't want to open up that can of worms. But you're going to invite Jesus to be a part of that conversation, and that's what's going to make the difference. It may be that you just will pray for your enemy, somebody that has been a source of contention for you for years, and you're going to turn that around and begin to pray for them. It may be that you serve somebody. It might not be your thing to serve, but because you're plugged in with Jesus, you now have the ability and the capacity to be able to serve another person. And so you're going to do that, and you get an opportunity to do it each and every day this week. Or simply, it may be that you pray. You pray for the people around you. You just do some things that you wouldn't do without Jesus. Or it could be, for some of you, you've got this big risk that you've just been holding off, and you're not willing to take the risk or take the chance because you're nervous. Allow Jesus to be a part of that. Allow him to guide you in that. And if you still get the go from Jesus, then go do it. Just rely on him as you take that next step. But as you do it, I would encourage you with this. Don't do it on your own. Do it plugged in. Because the whole idea, there's some of us that could really easily this week, I'm going to do some things that are going to stretch me. And I'm just going to do it under my own power. That's not the point of this morning. The point of this morning is to get plugged into Jesus so that you'll do the things that he's asking you to do, so that you see 5, 10, 15,000 people get fed, so that you see the wind die down. And with that in mind, I'm going to pray for us because I think we need Jesus' help to do this, right? Well, Jesus, thank you for this morning, and thank you for your word. God, thank you that you show up in the midst of our struggles. And God, thank you that you're teaching me, and hopefully you're teaching each of us in this room, that our gifts and abilities, our very best efforts, don't compare to what you can do. And so, Father, we want you. We want more of you in our lives. And so, God, help us with that. This morning, we just give you this next week. God, we give you those things that are already in our minds right now. that we're hesitant to do, but we know you're calling us to. So, Father, would you help us? Would you allow us to be plugged into you? And would you allow us, God, to just see those incredible things you want to do in our lives? And so we lift up all of these things to you in the name of Jesus. Amen.
If you're ready to take the next step in your spiritual journey or continue to support SouthPoint, you can connect to a small group, serve on a team, and give financially by clicking the box on the right. To watch other sermons from SouthPoint Church, click the playlist on the left. Click the logo to subscribe.